Lynsey Addario with us this evening to talk about her book. In a moment, I'm going to hand you over to Alexia Singh, who's the editor-in-charge at Reuters Images. Before I do that, if I can just ask you to switch your phones to silent. And when it comes to questions, I'm sure you'll have lots of them, if you can wait for the microphone, because we are broadcasting live this evening. So, over to Alexia.
Okay. Am I on? Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening, Lynsey.
Hi.
Award-winning photojournalist, author now, and if the rumours that are buzzing around are to be believed, soon to be on the silver screen. True? Can you comment? Let's get it out of the way.
I can't really comment. I think there will be some sort of movie. Yeah.
Okay.
But
fantastic.
I can't say much more than that.
Okay, can't confirm anything. All right. Okay.
I think everyone knows Hollywood. You can't confirm anything anyway until it happens. So.
Okay, well, we'll wait with bated breath. Okay, well, we're going to start, I think, with just looking through some of your pictures, and you're going to talk us through it, and yeah, we'll take it from there.
Great. So I will, can you all hear me? Yeah, okay. So I will show probably 25 minutes of photos and tell some stories behind the photos, and you can interject. Okay. Many people ask how a young woman from Connecticut, I grew up in Connecticut in the US, becomes a war photographer, and I thought I would just start with a family portrait.
Which one? Guess which one is
the
Lynsey?
Youngest of 4 sisters and my parents. And when I was 8 years old, my dad came out of the closet and ran off with my mother's best friend, who was a hairdresser. They were all hairdressers. Yep. And this was a typical weekend at my house growing up. The men were all dressed as women, and they had mock weddings, and half the women were topless, and it was just a crazy scene. So in my house, there were no rules.
Is it like that now in your...
Still pretty close. So in 2000, thank you. In 2000, I moved to India. I had been freelancing for the Associated Work in the late 90s, and I always wanted to move overseas. And so in 2000, I moved to India and tried to make it as a freelancer. I had great support from the Associated Press, and here in the audience. And I had a roommate at the time. I was renting Dow Jones bureau chief, and he came home from a trip to Afghanistan. And this is when Afghanistan was under the Taliban, and many of the correspondents based in India at the time were covering Afghanistan because the Taliban was giving visas for journalists, but photography was illegal. Photography of any living thing was illegal. So any photographer who went had to photograph buildings or destruction, and if they wanted to photograph people, they had to sneak around. So he came back to Afghanistan and he said, you know, you're a woman, and you should photograph women living under the Taliban because there are so few female journalists going there, and you can get great stories. And I was 26 years old, and I didn't think twice. I had zero money in the bank, and no one was willing to actually send me there. So I borrowed money from my sister, and I went. And this is what Kabul looked like in large part at the time. The only women one saw on the streets were beggars, because widows, many of these women are widows. They were not able to work, and their husbands were not alive, so they were reduced to begging. And this particular street, this is in Wazir Akbarham, which is a very busy section of Kabul now. And there's a big shopping mall behind this, and this is all paved. It looks totally different. And this is in the hospital. This is a woman giving birth, and there were very few doctors and midwives and almost no medicine. So this is a very typical scene, and I did a lot of work in the women's hospitals at the time because there weren't many female journalists, and as a woman I was allowed into these female-only areas, and the Taliban couldn't come in. So I actually could photograph.
What was these women's reaction to seeing you with a camera, a Western, you know?
So many women at that time were so shocked to actually see a Westerner who had the courage to be there at the time, and they knew that nothing would get back to Afghanistan because there was no TV, there were no news, there was very little news coming back into Afghanistan. So ironically, people were much more open to being photographed then. So I could go into people's homes and they let me photograph. And now when I try to do it, it's much more difficult because everyone sees social media and everything goes back to Afghanistan. So it's much more complicated now than it was ironically then. In 2001, when September 11th happened, I went right back to Pakistan, Afghanistan. I had already moved to Mexico. And I went back and covered the fall of the Taliban in Kandahar. And in 2003, I decided it was very clear that the U.S. was going to war in Iraq, and I wanted to be there. I hadn't really ever covered combat, but I knew that I felt it was important to be there. And so I started some homework, and I realized I wanted to go into northern Iraq because I felt like it would be the safest way to cover the fall of Saddam. I spent about 2 months there before Saddam fell in April of 2003 and eventually worked my way down through Kirkuk. So these are some initial scenes of euphoria. And the troops in front of one of Saddam's palaces in Tikrit. And these are troops who had made their way from Kuwait, and they were just shaving and bathing sort of in front of
And who are you with at this point? Are you still freelancing?
Yeah.
Have you got like a support network behind you, or are you just going in and seeing what happens?
So on this, as the war in Iraq, as it was clear we were going to war, the New York Times Magazine put me on assignment, and it was an open assignment, and I was on for almost 4 months,
wow.
which is astonishing because that would never happen now. But they basically teamed me up with Elizabeth Rubin and said, go and see what the story is. So I had the support network of the New York Times Magazine. And
I guess a lot of this was off the back of the fact that you kind of proved yourself in some way a little bit by going into Afghanistan, by being in a kind of country where there were these restrictions, do you think, or were they just purely taking a chance on you?
I think it was a little bit of that. When I was covering right after September 11th, when I was covering Pakistan, I pitched a story to the New York Times Magazine on the women who are married to the Islamic leaders in Pakistan and what are their families like. And so that was my first experience with them, and it sort of opened several other stories after that.
Right.
So by
there was a little bit of a history with you guys, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So they sent me in. But very quickly we started to see mass graves. It was these incredible scenes of devastation. In this room, these are all bodies that you see wrapped in white sheets. We would travel. We heard that there were mass graves south of Baghdad in Hilla, and we went there. And I had never seen anything like this. It was in Afghanistan. It was very different. The Taliban fell, and there were stories to be covered, but we didn't see mass graves. This is a scene where there was sort of an open field. It was almost the size of a football field. And everywhere I turned, there were just plastic bags filled with bones and shards of cloth. And people were looking for their relatives, literally in plastic bags, and trying to identify them through bones and pieces of anything that remained of their clothing.
And was this the first time you'd come across this kind of thing? Right. How did you react?
I didn't really know how to photograph it, because when you see something like that, it's so intimidating, because you think, how can I possibly capture this amount of devastation and tragedy in one frame? And so for me, it was really overwhelming. And I remember the first time I walked up to that field, I sort of just stood there and I couldn't even photograph for like 45 minutes. I just looked around and didn't take any pictures because I couldn't figure out how to do it. Right. And then I sort of slowly eased into it. And it's also really sensitive because people are so emotional, and you don't want to be disrespectful at all and just walk right up to people. So, yeah. And then very quickly, it became clear that the Americans had no plan for the aftermath of the fall of Saddam Hussein. So people, there was no electricity, there was no water, there were fires burning across Iraq, really, from looting. Many fires just impromptu started across the cities. And this is at a propane distribution, and these women were lined up waiting to get their propane tanks filled because many people cooked with propane. And so they were waiting online for hours under the hot sun, and suddenly the American troops got mad because they were getting anxious, and they started gassing them with this green gas. And I remember thinking, my God, that's so strange. Aren't we here to like bring them freedom? And here we are gassing these people. And in 2004, I had spent almost 2 years in Iraq at that point, and I still had not seen injured American soldiers, and the insurgency was in full swing. And Life magazine called me up and said, we have this great assignment for you. We would like you to go during the siege of Fallujah in November of 2004 and photograph the wounded coming out of Fallujah, and you will have full access. It's with the military. And we got that access because the writer that I was working with, his grandfather and father were both in the military in some capacity as medics. And so they trusted him. So we were invited in, and we were able to access scenes like this. I mean, this is a young man who had stepped on an IED, and he was flying back to Germany like that for the first round of treatment.
Do you think that it's become harder to do that kind of story? You know, that as the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan continued, that it became even more tightly controlled in terms of what you were allowed to photograph with the army?
Well, what happened in this scenario is I spent 4 days on the ground, and I flew back to Germany with them, and then eventually flew back to the States with them, and I filed about 100 pictures to Life magazine, and my pictures are out of order, so I can't find the other ones right now, but about 100 pictures to Life magazine, and they held the pictures, and I was so eager to get them out because it was right before the re-election of George Bush, and I thought, surely if Americans saw what's happening in Iraq, and if they saw wounded soldiers for the first time, they'll react. And so Life magazine held them through November, December, January, and February. And in late February, I got an email from my editor, the photo editor. And she said, I hate to write you this email, but we will never run your pictures from Iraq because my editor thinks they're too strong for the American public to see. And so I was in Azerbaijan for the New York Times. I remember reading the email, and I was completely devastated. And I said, am I free to send them elsewhere? And she said, now you are. It had been 4 months. And Bush had been reelected. And I sent them to the New York Times Magazine. I had an editor that at that point I had had a relationship with, and she got them in the next issue of the New York Times Magazine. So that was an instance where there's censorship on every level. I think when you're working as a journalist, sometimes it's the military, sometimes it's your own editor, and so I think it's really important to figure out how to navigate that.
I mean, there's always been this feeling, hasn't it, that the American public do not want to see dead soldiers. I don't know who decided that. You know, I'm sure there's
it's
a
still,
lot of people that would want to see that.
I mean, it's still the case. We still have. I'll go into that because I'll show some. So this is during sort of the insurgency. I spent a lot of time embedded with the troops as well. Oh, here are the other injured soldiers. Sorry. Here are some of those other pictures. And we would go on night raids, and often we weren't really told. We were going into hostile villages. They would round up men. And they never hindered our access, actually, in this capacity. We were able to shoot everything as part of the night raids, but we really couldn't ask many questions. And this particular image is part of that embed with in Fallujah. So these are all wounded soldiers coming out of Fallujah. And if you see, this is the inside of a C-17 cargo plane. And it has been completely stripped down because there were so many wounded coming out of Fallujah that they stripped them down and actually lied the soldiers on the floor of the base of the plane and strapped them to the sides, and that's how they flew them to Germany. So this is one of the images that my editor at Life magazine said they couldn't run.
Did it get published in the end?
The New York Times Magazine ended up running it a double truck, so 2 pages. And I think they eventually ran a 6-page spread of some of these pictures. I must have a PDF somewhere. So in 2004, I guess this is being streamed, so I can't try and fix this. In 2004, I started working in Darfur. I had been working in Iraq at that point for 2 years, and I was really ready to step away from Iraq. I felt like because the insurgency was really gearing up, and it was more and more difficult for me to actually photograph
incredibly
anything
dangerous, right, at that time.
It was dangerous, but I think as a journalist, you weigh the risks for the benefit. I mean, can you still work? It's dangerous, but can you still tell stories? And for me, I felt at that point I couldn't really effectively tell stories, so I turned my attention to working in Darfur. And in order to work in Darfur at that time, the Sudanese government wasn't freely giving visas to journalists. And so you had to fly into Chad and walk several kilometers into Darfur from Chad. So we had arranged to meet up with the Sudanese rebels, and we walked across the border and we saw burned villages and displaced people sitting under trees. We literally just drove through the desert of northwest Darfur for about a week, and everywhere we turned, we saw displaced people, we saw bodies, we saw burned villages. And I continued covering Darfur for 6 years. I went every year, and I would spend about a month. Sometimes I went twice a year. And each time it was incredibly difficult to get access. Either I had to fly into Chad and walk in, or I went to Sudan and was able to get a visa from the government in Khartoum. But then once a journalist got to Khartoum, they then had to apply for a visa or a permit to go to Darfur. And once you get to Darfur, you need a permit to actually go to the camp. So basically, anyone who wanted to work in Darfur spent about 95% of their time getting permits stamped, and only about 5% of the time reporting.
And you say you walk in like it's no big thing, but I mean, in the book you talk about walking in, and this is like walking through the desert for days, right, in burning heat, with no shelter, with limited water. It's it's not just a little walk in.
No, it was really tough because, of course, you never imagine you're going to a place where there's not a single shop, where you can't actually buy water. So we very stupidly, when we were walking in, stripped down our belongings so much that we each only brought 2 bottles of water, which in the desert in August doesn't last very long. So we ran out of water on like the second day there, and basically went on this frantic search to find a well, and finally on the 3rd day we found a well. But it was pretty terrifying because we were smack in the middle of the desert and there was no water source. There were these wadis, but it was all mud. So
when you say we, were you with a journalist?
I was with a New York Times correspondent, Somini Sengupta, and 2 photographers, Jihad Inga and Jahi Chikwande. And in 2006, I was in Chad with Lydia Polgreen for the New York Times, and we had heard that there had been a big massacre of Sudanese government soldiers, and many of those soldiers are conscripted from South Sudan and forced to fight for the Sudanese government in the north. And the Sudanese government was denying it. President Bashir was saying absolutely no, there was no massacre. And Lydia Polgreen, who's an incredible correspondent, she and I went to the border of Darfur with Chad, and we stopped a group of rebels and we said, hey, can you take us? Did this massacre really happen? And they said, yeah. And you can go, but there are Antonovs, which are the Russian aircraft flying overhead by the government, waiting to bomb any rebels that come in that area. And we said, well, for the New York Times, we actually have to see it in order to report on it. So and they said, well, look, you can go at your own risk. We can drive you in and you can see it very quickly. So we went in, and as we approached the site, there were bodies everywhere throughout the desert. And so this picture was on the cover of the New York Times the next day, and President Bashir couldn't deny that there had been a massacre. So for me, an image like this, it just is proof. It documents, it is the reason for me why I'm a photographer, because it provides proof of what happens. And you can't have that unless you physically go to that place. So these are some more images from Darfur.
This became a story that was quite sort of personal to you, is that right? That you went back, you were one of very few people that continued to go back, and you saw this story become something that people actually started to talk about and.
Yeah, I think all the stories I do are personal to me because I spend so much time doing them, and obviously the longer I spend invested in a story, the more familiar I become with it, and the more comfortable I feel, and the more passionate I feel, because I'm spending 6 years going back to the same place, and I'm getting to know the people and the culture. So In 2008, I got a call from Dexter Filkins. Dexter Filkins is an American war correspondent. He used to work for the New York Times for many years, and now he works for the New Yorker. And Dexter is an old friend. We originally met in India in 2000 when he was based there for the LA Times. And we then worked together for almost a decade in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Dexter is the kind of person who talks to everyone with the same tone of voice, no matter who you are. And so he called me up and he said, "Hey, dude, I got the best story for us." I said, "Yeah, Dex." And he said, "It's on the Talibanization of Pakistan." And I remember my husband, who was then my boyfriend, sort of looked at me and he's like, "You are not going to meet the Taliban." And I didn't say anything because I never say anything before I actually go. And so I said to Dex, "Okay, go. You go ahead, figure it out, see if you can line it up, and then I'll fly in, because there's no point in me sitting in Peshawar near the tribal area for a month." So Dexter went ahead and a month there, and then he called me up and he said, "Okay, come, because I think I'm getting close." And so I went to Peshawar, which is a pretty creepy town near the Afghan border in Pakistan. And we got a call from Haji Namdar, who was the Taliban commander in the tribal area that we were going to visit. And he said, "Okay, you are welcome to come tomorrow, but the only thing you cannot do is bring a woman." And so Dexter and I sort of looked at each other, and Halim, who was our translator, who was pretty sympathetic to the Taliban, he looked at us and he said, "Oh no, what will we do? Because Haji Namdar said we can't bring a woman, and Madam, you are a woman and you are the photographer." And I said, Dexter and I just sort of looked at each other and said, "Look, we're not separating, so you have to figure it out." So then he comes back like an hour later and he says, "I have a great idea. We will say you are Mr. Dexter's wife, and he cannot leave his wife alone in a strange city, so you must come." And so I said, "Okay, fine, we're husband and wife. We don't care." We said we just wanted to do this and get the story. So we dress up, and it was the first time in 9 years I'd ever seen Dexter wearing something other than khaki pants and a white button-down, because he always looked like a CIA agent. And he finally wore like a shalwar kameez, and I thought, oh my God, we're crazy. This must be really, really dangerous if Dexter's actually not wearing his uniform. So we show up and we drive through the tribal area, which is terrifying, because though we had permission from Haji Namdar, we did not have permission from the other Taliban commanders in the area. So had something happened to us, had the car broken down, we were not invited by them. So we got to Haji Namdar's compound and parked the car outside. I had to sit in the car for a minute while the men went in and asked. And they asked permission for me to come in. And he said yes. So I went inside. And I walked into this very small room. It was probably less than half the size of this room. And there were about 15 to 20 fighters in the room, and they all had their weapons and prosthetic legs and everything propped against the walls. And I was fully veiled. There was nothing. I was completely covered. And I walked in the room and sort of sat down next to Dexter. And it was incredibly awkward, because obviously women don't show up in these situations very often, and everyone was really uncomfortable. And so I was just sort of sitting there, and Dexter said, "Hey, Haji Namdar, thanks for inviting us. This is my wife." And Haji Namdar says, "Very nice to meet you." He won't look up. And then Dexter says, "And my wife has a camera. Do you mind if she takes some photos?" And so he says, yes, that's okay. So I started shooting as much as I possibly could, because I had no idea how long it would last. And about 15 minutes into it, one of his guys came over, and Dexter was in the middle of an interview, and everyone was getting really fidgety. And I thought, oh my God, now they're going to kill us. Like, okay, we've been here 15 minutes. Sure, we're going to get killed. And they said, "Madam, we would like to serve you tea, but we don't know how you can drink the tea through your veil." And I thought, this is a part of the world that is incredibly hospitable. People, when they invite you to their home, they will do, they feed you, they give you tea, they give you... So I started laughing to myself, thinking, of course I have to drink tea, So I said, "Well, I'm sorry, I can't take off my veil." And so they said, no, we have an idea, we made a plan. Go stand in the corner of the room, face the wall, lift your veil, drink your tea, and come back. So that was my meeting with the Taliban.
I remember when I was reading this bit in the book as well, you have a kind of observation there that or maybe it was elsewhere actually, that actually working as a female photojournalist in the kind of Muslim world, in some way you could work it to your advantage, because as well as this hospitality, there is this kind of respect for women, respect for children, putting you on a pedestal, and you kind of learn how to sort of work with that a bit, and is that right to say that you could sort of turn it to your advantage?
Absolutely.
In the end?
I always think it's a great advantage to be a woman working in these situations, because I have access to women and I have access to men, and I often go sort of people underestimate me a lot, which is great. They just think, oh, she's a woman, she's not going to do anything, and which to me is such a great benefit, because I prefer to be underestimated.
I think you say as well that as well as being a woman, because you were a journalist, they really didn't know how to deal with you.
Yeah,
it was like, right, you're
like
a woman, therefore we have to, Yeah, you know, it's almost as if most of your working career, I guess, has been in a Muslim world, and conversely, it can work to your advantage.
I think it does often. So, in 2009, it was December of 2009, and I was doing an embed with the medevac team, and those are that is the team of troops that go in and pick up the injured out of theater. So either or Afghanistan. And I was in southern Afghanistan, and we got a call that there had been an alpha, which means the most gravely wounded soldier. And so things move very, very quickly. And it's all with night vision goggles. So from the minute they get the call, you only have seconds to get to the helicopter, jump on the helicopter, take your position, and start moving. Oh, crap. Hold on. Sorry. I'm going to do something that's not really good, but sorry. Just do this for a second. You can talk for a second. I just want this in order. Sorry. And if
well,
you're
actually,
streaming,
you know what?
you can
There was
unstream
something
it.
that I wanted to mention just while you're doing that. It was one of my favourite bits in the book, talking about how you can use being a woman to your advantage, but obviously not always. There's the time when it's like post 9/11 and you're in Pakistan and there's an anti-US demo going on. Is that right? And you're in a crowd and it turns a bit hostile, and you know, comments are coming and hands are kind of grabbing you, and you get fed up and you get basically. So share that. It's a great story.
I think people don't often realize what people talk about sexual harassment and when someone's photographing or working, or when a woman is in a place that's predominantly male. And in this situation, it actually was a great disadvantage to be a woman, because it was right after 9/11 and there were all these demonstrations going on and people protesting and burning effigies of George Bush. And I went with a group of male colleagues in Peshawar. And I was fully veiled, and I went, and as I was photographing, there were hands on my butt the entire time. People were grabbing me, and I kept pretending like, okay, I'm just going to stay focused, I'm just going to shoot, I'm not going to respond, so I stayed very focused, and there were hands, and they got more and more aggressive, sort of as things started burning around me, they got more aggressive, and finally I got so mad. I had an 80 to 200 2.8 millimeter lens, so a very big lens. And I got so angry that I turned around. First I back kicked, like a karate kick, and I turned around and I smacked this guy, whoever was close to me, on the top of the head. And I remember I looked at him and his eyes just started rolling back, and I just started running as fast as I could. And I ran and I got in the car, and I remember I met with like 3 or 4 of my male colleagues who were all photographers, and I get in the car with them, and it's like they're all kicking back and looking at their digital photos, and it was like I was panting and sweaty and had been grabbed, and I just thought, like, these guys have no idea what it's like just to cover a demonstration, what I have to go through. I'm like knocking people out to take a photo.
Do you always travel with an 80 to 200 after that?
No, I travel with a man. I always have a man with me. So, okay, I got them in order. So in 2009, I was with the medevac team, and we got a call for an alpha, and we started flying in. And some of these pictures are as we're flying in, I was just trying to literally focus through the night vision goggles. And we landed, and the flight was only about 2 minutes away. And we landed in the middle of nowhere. It was sort of a field, and they put this young man wrapped in a blanket on the floor of the helicopter. And I was photographing through the goggles, which is incredibly difficult because it's very hard to focus and there's no depth perception. We flew back with him, and to me, he was not really responsive. I thought maybe he's already dead. I didn't really know. And as a journalist, it's a very sensitive moment, obviously, because you want to be sensitive not only to the medics, but to whoever you're photographing. And so I had made an arrangement with the team that in this situation, if we ever got into that situation, I would shoot, and then we would discuss whether I could use the pictures after, depending on what happened. We took him back to the tent. It was a field hospital, and very quickly the entire medical team filled up in this tent hospital. And there were doctors, Navy nurses, people coming, and it was very clear that he was still unresponsive. He had lost 8 pints of blood. And for 28 minutes, they tried to bring him back to life, and they were massaging his heart. And throughout this process, I did not move my position at all. I was at the foot of the bed, and I was shooting, and it was so silent in the room that every single shutter, every single click of my shutter, I felt like completely invasive, and like I was trying so hard to be respectful, but it was a very difficult situation. And one of the officers came up to me in the middle of this and said, "Hey, stop taking pictures." And I put my camera down and I said, I have permission to be here. And I didn't want to fight with him because it was such a horrible time. And I just said, I have permission to be here. I put the camera down. And 3 other soldiers stood up and said, no, let her photograph. She needs to be here. This has to be documented. And so I was able to continue shooting. And eventually the young man passed away. And they did a whole ritual and said a prayer over his body, put a flag on his body. And when I returned to the U.S., I'm not allowed to call the next of kin, and in order to publish any photograph showing the face of whoever dies, the KIA, the killed in action, you need permission from the next of kin. For a photo like this, he's not visible, so I am able to publish without asking, but I did want to talk to the family. And so as a journalist, you're not able to call the family. They have to call you if they want to reach out to you. So minutes after I finished photographing this scene, 2 public affairs officers from the Marines came to me and said, look, you can't send those photos out right now. The family hasn't been notified. I said, yes, of course. And they said, do you want to be contacted by the family if they wish to reach out to you? And I said, yes. So I landed to go back to the States, I think it was December 9th, and I got a call from his father. And it was a voicemail, and I remember I was tremoring, and I called him back, and I had about an hour-long conversation with his father, and he asked me to recount every single second that I was with his son when he died. And he asked me to look at the photos before he would give permission. And I said, I'm not sure you want to see the photos. They're incredibly graphic. He asked to see everything. He said, I just want to be close to my son until in every single minute that I can. And as a journalist, you're not obliged to do that, especially before the pictures are published. Generally, we don't show anyone any pictures before they're published, but it was such a specific situation. And I did send the father the photos, and he decided that he could not give permission, that his wife would not be able to handle it. So this is one of the very few photos that was published in that series. And in 2009, I was doing a story for National Geographic magazine on women in Afghanistan. And I had been working in Afghanistan at that point for 10 years and had photographed extensively the conditions for women living under the Taliban and women living after the fall of the Taliban. And one of the issues I wanted to include was maternal mortality, because Afghanistan has such a high rate of women dying in childbirth, actually one of the highest in the world, because women don't have access to hospitals. There are very few roads in the country. So I spent about a week or 10 days photographing in very remote areas of Badakhshan province, one of these provinces with very few roads. And on the way back, I was with a female translator. And we were driving back to Faizabad, the capital of Badakhshan, and we saw these 2 women on the side of the mountain. And we both thought it was really strange to see 2 women without a man in the middle of nowhere, because we were accompanied by men. And so we stopped the car, and Dr. Ziba and I ran up And we said, what are you doing? Why are you here? And they said, well, Noor Nisa, who is the woman on the right, is in labor. And she's married to a man whose first wife died in childbirth. And he's so determined to not lose his second wife in childbirth that he rented a car. He borrowed money from people in the village, rented a car, and was trying to drive her to the hospital when their car broke down. So he left them on the side of the road to go find another car. And I said, well, just get in my car. I'll take you to the hospital. And they said, we can't. We need permission from her husband. So I looked at Ziba, who is an Afghan who had spent about 20 years in New Zealand. And I looked at Ziba and I said, go find the husband. She said, okay. Well, there was one road that went through the whole province, so it was pretty easy. She took our car. She found the husband very quickly and brought him back. And the whole family came into our car and we drove them to the hospital, and she delivered in the hospital. And everyone asked, did I photograph the delivery? And I said no, because the only reason she delivered in the hospital is because I brought her there. So journalistically, I didn't think it was ethical to keep shooting. Right, yeah. But these are the initial pictures I took when I walked up, and we had asked their permission. And I took about 5 frames, and that's all I shot from that entire shoot.
Amazing.
And in 2011, I volunteered to go photograph the uprising in Libya. I had missed the uprising in Egypt because I was in Afghanistan and Iraq, and I really wanted to go to Libya. And so I called my editor at the New York Times, and I said, please send me. And he said, we already have 5 photographers, but I'll send you. And I said, so like so many journalists covering the uprising in Libya, we crossed illegally from Egypt. And we knew that one of the big risks was that we could run into Gaddafi's troops. Gaddafi had made it very clear he did not want journalists there. And he made announcements saying, if you see Western journalists, kill them because they're spies, and you should execute them. And so we started to move forward on the front line in Libya. And it was very clear from the beginning that these guys were completely untrained. This is in February of 2011 and March of 2011, in the very first weeks of the uprising when it became violent. And what you're looking at is we were on the front line, which was literally just a road that cut through the desert from east to west. And a helicopter gunship came in, and they were literally hovering right above us, spraying the ground all around us with 50 caliber bullets. And these guys had nothing to protect themselves but Kalashnikovs and guns, and they were throwing rocks up in the air at the helicopter. And I myself was hiding beneath like a tin can of a car that clearly wasn't armored, but it was the only place I could think to hide, because in the desert there really is no place to hide. And this is sort of what some of the fighting looked like. It was completely open. Often we hid in those silos, the cement silos that you see, and you would hear airplanes and bombs would literally just land next to you. And it was just a matter of luck, really, whether you were able to stay out of a bomb, stay away from a bomb. And so I stayed on the front line for about 2 weeks, covering pretty intensive fighting. And I was ready to pull back to Benghazi when I was with 3 colleagues for the New York Times, and we were in the village of Ajdabia. And it was pretty clear that Gaddafi's troops were about to retake the city. And there are signs, obviously. The mortars were coming closer and closer. Civilians were starting to flee. And our driver started getting calls saying Gaddafi's troops are in the city. I was in a car with 3 colleagues, so there are 4 journalists and a driver in the car. And I'm sure there are a lot of journalists in the room. Are all pretty greedy and stubborn, and everyone has a different idea of how long we want to stay and what our needs are. So some of us wanted to go back to the hospital to get phone numbers from doctors. Others wanted to go forward back to the front line. So by the time we decided to pull back, we ended up running into a checkpoint set up by Gaddafi's troops. And this is the exact place that we saw the checkpoint. We literally were driving towards the horizon, and I was the first one in the car to actually notice that they were Gaddafi's troops. And I said to my colleagues, I think those are Gaddafi's guys. And they said, no, they're not. They started laughing, and they said, you know, there's no way they're ahead of us because they're still behind us. But they had actually flanked the desert and came all the way around and cut the road in front of us. So we were trying to figure out, should we try and drive through the checkpoint or stop and announce ourselves as journalists? Our driver panicked, and he jumped out of the car and said, we're Sahafa journalists. And immediately everyone was ripped out of the car. I was sitting behind the driver on the left, and I ended up crawling across the back seat to try and get out. And I could see in that moment, the rebels that we had been covering started opening fire on that checkpoint. And so we were caught literally in a wall of bullets. And so each one of us was sort of trying to get away from the troop, Gaddafi's troop, that was holding us back. Eventually, we ran for cover behind that cement building. And there was a handful of Gaddafi's troops, and they made us lie face down on the ground. Each one of us, there were 4 of us, each one of us. We never saw our driver again. We lied face down on the ground, and each one put a gun to our heads. And they were deciding whether to execute us. And Anthony Shadid, who spoke Arabic, later translated for us. They went back and forth and said, okay, shoot them now, don't shoot them, they're American, you can't shoot them. And each one of us was just begging for our lives. They did not shoot us. Immediately they tied us up. For me, they took my shoes off, took the laces out of my shoes and tied my wrists and ankles and carried me away. And of course, my first thought as a woman is, now they're going to rape me. They took me away. They put each one of us in a car, in 2 vehicles on the front line, and kept us there for about 4 or 5 hours while bombs landed around us and sniper fire was around us, and it was we were tied up. We could do nothing. At one point, I thought I saw our driver's body. I'm not sure because in those moments it's incredibly traumatic, and I couldn't really tell. We were pretty far away, and that went on. We were beaten. Blindfolded, and I was groped very aggressively for the first 3-4 days, and eventually we were flown to Tripoli, and we were released after 6 days of captivity. And 2 weeks later, a photographer for the New York Times went back to the spot to help Mohammed, our driver, his family body or look to see if he was in prison. And when they went, they found my shoe on the side of the road, and it was still there without the laces because they had used that to tie me up. So I'll just close with a few pictures of me on assignment, just so you can see sort of how I dress when I'm working. This is me in Pakistan in 2001, and in Darfur, and crossing into Darfur through Chad. In Afghanistan. Afghanistan with the troops in the Korangal Valley. This is in the Korangal Valley. And this is in Kandahar in Afghanistan. And that's me 7 months pregnant in Gaza. Took a lot of heat for that. And that's it.
I bet. Wow. That's seriously dramatic story to end on, Lynsey, but then there's all, you get married after that, you've got a 3-year-old son, you're still working, you're still out in the field, you're getting heat for that, but your male colleagues aren't, which we talked about earlier. You seem, in reading the book, you seem like a very resilient, well-adjusted person. You've been through an awful lot. And it struck me that as well as being someone that is physically and mentally tough, you insist on holding your own when you're out with your male colleagues. You're not going to be the one that says, I'm tired, I want to stop. But yet at the same time, there are many points in the book when you talk about being scared, where you want to leave a situation and you do that. Do you think that that ability to be able to express your fear as well as being tough might have helped you to have sort of mentally survived all the things that you've gone through?
I don't know. I think that's a good question. I think for me, one of the most important things about this work is listening to your instincts and listening to when I've had enough. And I think I never want to be that person who says, I'm scared and can we turn back now and I can't keep up, especially when I'm on a military embed and I'm with the troops. I try really hard to be fit and to keep up and to but at the same time, if there's a body of work that I did not show, and it's from the Korangal Valley, where Elizabeth Rubin, a colleague of mine for the New York Times Magazine, and I spent 2 months living on the side of the mountain in Afghanistan. And it was the same sort of scenario that Tim Hetherington did with Restrepo. And we were at bases very close to one another. And so we were the only two women for about 2 months, and every day we went on these very rigorous patrols and literally slept in a bunker. And at the end, we were dropped onto the side of a mountain for Operation Rock Avalanche, which was a very big battalion-wide operation where the 173rd Airborne was going into the most hostile areas in that area, looking for the Taliban, basically to draw them out to start a gun battle. And so we were dropped onto the side of a mountain and had to walk for 6 days with everything on our backs, food, water, our sleeping bags, everything. And it was pretty terrifying. And it was a bit of fighting, and at the end we were ambushed from 3 sides by the Taliban, and 3 soldiers we were with were shot. 1 was killed. I had actually just walked away to go find a place to pee, and so I was all alone when the ambush started, which was completely terrifying. And at the end of that, I just felt like I couldn't take it anymore. I was scared, and I knew that I was so scared, I was paralyzed by my own fear, that I didn't think I would be able to keep up. And at that point, I asked Captain Kearney, who was the commander, to get me out. And I just felt like, as much as I hated saying the words, "I'm scared, can you please get me out?" I knew that I would be of no benefit to anyone. So I just asked to leave, and I ended up flying out with Sergeant Rugel's belongings because he had been killed.
Right. So, are we all right to carry on for a bit, or do you want to? Yeah, okay. So, I was saying now, obviously, you're married, you have a son, you still go out and work. You say in your book you're still restless. And there's a nice anecdote where you're sitting in a cafe in Notting Hill when the Gaza conflict goes on, and you kind of look around you and you think, much as I love the secure family life that I've got now, I want to be there. You still, despite everything that you've been through, you still have that drive to work.
Yeah, I remember I was in Cafe 202, and there was a woman feeding wine to her poodle. And I was sitting there, and all of my colleagues were in Gaza. And I just was sitting there, and I had a newborn, and I was miserable. I just thought, what am I doing? This is not who I am. I'm surrounded by people giving wine to their poodles. So it was really mortifying. So I think, it just is a matter of finding that balance. Of course, when someone decides to have a child, there are sacrifices that come along with that. Of course, I was well aware of that, but it's not to say it's easy. It's not to say you make that decision and, okay, everything's great, I've made that decision. And I'm pretty honest about that in the book, because I feel like so few people are honest about it, and that frustrates me, because you open yourself up to a lot of criticism when you talk about the ambivalence of motherhood, or that it's not all the most glorious thing on the planet. And so for me, I just felt like, if I'm going to do this, I will be honest about it. Yeah. And so... Yeah.
Well, we said working mother, right, like millions of other people, but... fatherhood, somehow it's okay to go to war, but...
Yeah, no one ever talks about male war correspondents who go to war with an entire family at home, and what happens if they get killed. For some reason, it doesn't matter if a father dies, but it does matter if a mother dies. So that, to me, is a double standard I think we need to reevaluate, or address.
Yeah, should we... I just wanted to say, actually, before we go on, just last question, and then I'll throw it open, was just about writing the book. It was a kind of moment for you to reflect after the sort of trauma of Libya, and just before we throw it open,
Sure.
Can you just talk a little bit, what was it like to suddenly be a writer,
Sure. So, right after Libya, I was approached by several literary agents, and I sort of was like, no, I'm not a writer, I don't want to write a book. In fact, maybe I should do a photo book, because I had never done a solo collection of photos. And so I was meeting with Aperture to try and do a coffee table book. And I had all my photos, actually there were photos from the Korangal Valley laid out on the table, and I was in a conference room with 3 people from Aperture, the publishing company in New York, and I saw an email on my BlackBerry that Tim Hetherington and Chris Hondros had been killed in Libya. And I never check my phone when I'm in a meeting, obviously, but it was flashing red, and I sort of looked over and I saw it, and I had a complete breakdown in the middle of the meeting. I mean, I was like convulsing and so embarrassed because I'd never met these people before. And they knew Tim and Chris, and so they were distraught. And so we all just sort of walked out, and I had... it was about a month after Libya, and after I was released from captivity in Libya, I actually was okay. I felt like we had survived, and we were so lucky to survive when our driver hadn't. And so it wasn't really until that moment that everything really hit me. And so I didn't want to do a photo book anymore. I sort of I said, I don't want to look at these photos for the next year. And at that point, I said, maybe I do want to write. And so I started looking back at journals and old correspondence I had, and looking through, just really thinking about what I would want to do, and wrote a book proposal. And then really did the bulk of my writing right when I was about 8 and 9 months pregnant and had just given birth. And then in that year...
God, seriously?
Yeah. I wrote like 60,000 words in that time, like when I was 8, 9 months pregnant in the first 3 months. And then got a book deal right after that, like sort of a few months after I'd given birth. And then spent about a year just writing the raw, like the bulk of the book, like just the vignettes of the different chapters. And then I hired someone about a year later to help me shape it and edit it. And so that person was incredible, because I was really adamant that I wanted it in my voice and not in someone else's voice. So she was a brilliant editor, because she just came in and asked me questions. So instead of trying to write or rewrite for me, she sort of took each chapter and sent them back to me with about 1,000 questions each. And so that's how we did it, going back and forth.
Okay, so yeah, now Millicent's got the microphone over there. If anyone wants to ask a question, please go ahead. Don't be shy.
Hello, it's quite a pleasure to be the first question. Thank you very much for this and for all your work and what I've done. It's just a big inspiration.
Thank you.
My question is about you said in 2004 you had this kind of censorship from Life magazine, which is something that I'm sure for you was. My question is, did you have any kind of situation since then, which actually I think, well, from 2004 until now, things have been even worse in that concerning, I think. Have you felt again kind of the same situation with other publications? Did you try to change that in a way? Did you?
Yeah, I mean, there's another scene I write about where I was working for the New York Times Magazine, and it's in the Korangal Valley. It's that 2-month embed we did. And at the beginning of that embed, initially we went in there to try to tell the story of civilian casualties and why so many Afghans were getting killed, when we apparently had this precision technology to pinpoint where the Taliban was. And we were trying to figure out, why are so many Afghans dying? And so we wanted to go to the most dangerous place in the country. So that's how we ended up there, because it was where the most bombs were being dropped. And so the night before we flew in to the main base there, we were in the Tactical Operations Center. And in a place like that, most of it is highly confidential, so it's very difficult to photograph, to even get access to photograph. But what it looks like is it's basically a room with 3 massive screens of drone feeds and heat-censored feeds from all around the area, and you can see every single thing going on. So you could see when there's movement, if there are troops in contact, you could see everything, basically, maps everywhere. And so we watched a battle go on between the Taliban and the American troops in the area we were about to fly into. And we asked to fly, and then at the end of the battle, the troops were pinned down for several hours. So at the end of the thing, the commander made a decision to drop 2 bombs, right, on the Taliban. And so we asked to fly in there the next morning, and they flew us right directly into that area to the base that was closest. And so we arrived at the base, and as we were arriving, this family was showing up, and there were 2 young boys that had what looked like shrapnel wounds on their faces and bloodshot eyes, totally traumatized, barely speaking. I took photos, and when I was in with the medic, I asked the medic, do you think these wounds are from last night? And he was like, no, everyone lies. There's no way to tell. They're not really consistent with shrapnel. Well, obviously, I didn't agree. Journalist, I just put his quote in the caption, and I meant to write the rest of the whole backstory when I was later. But basically, I didn't think we would be 2 months in the Korangal Valley. I thought we were going to do a week, and I would go home and write out all the captions like I always do. But we spent 2 months. And at the end of the 2 months, we were in this ambush, which was way more intense than that situation. So I just filed all these pictures and thought, okay, I'll let the New York Times look through their 8,000 pictures. And when they come back to me with the edit, then I'll go through and write up the captions. So I ended up going to Darfur. So I was in Sudan about to go into Darfur, and they decided to close the piece almost 5 months later. Okay, so now I shot that picture in September. They were closing the piece in, I think, February or March. So I get a frantic call from the New York Times saying, we're thinking of running this young boy on the cover of the New York Times Magazine to show like the collateral damage of war, but your caption says he wasn't injured in a bomb. And I said, no, this is the backstory. So I told the whole story. And the editor-in-chief of the New York Times didn't believe me. My colleague also was saying the same thing, and we even got Captain Kearney, the guy who was there with us, to say, yeah, but he was probably definitely injured, but it's war, so there's never 100%. So my editor went to the military public affairs officer and basically started fact-checking with him, which obviously the public affairs officer doesn't want anyone to think that an Afghan kid has been injured in a bomb. So he pulled the picture from not only the cover of the magazine, but he pulled it from the entire layout and said, I will never publish this picture of Khalid. And so that was egregious. I mean, to me, it was like, I asked permission from my editor to write the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine, and she gave me permission, and I wrote like a very scathing letter that's in the book. Art?
Yeah. That's an interesting story. It raises a couple of questions. I want to go back to Darfur for a minute. If you got called to testify at the International Criminal Court against Bashir about the genocide, or not the genocide, but the massacre that you saw, number one, would you do that, and how would you feel about that? And then, what would you do if an American military tribunal called you and wanted you to relate what happened on the story that you just told? Would you be willing to get involved in that?
I don't know, actually. Those are really good questions. I'm freelance, so I would have to do a lot of homework as to whether I would or should. And so I would talk to the New York Times, I would talk to lawyers, and I would talk to other journalists and see if that's ethical, unethical. I don't know, because no one's ever asked me. I have been asked by people to use my photographs as evidence in, like, the U.S. Congress was showing scenes from Darfur as like, this is a genocide scene, pictures, and I have been asked to give my photos to things like that, and I have no problem with that because they're photos and they're basically, for me, they're documents of, I was there and here they are. But I don't know if I would personally testify. I think that goes beyond my I'm not sure I would feel comfortable with that. I'd have to ask.
That really was not expected. First of all, Lynsey, thank you so much for the most extraordinary presentation. It was really impressive.
Thank you.
And the voice that you have given as a female being in war zones is different and quantum leaps for perhaps what we've all seen from Lee Miller sleeping in sitting in a tub that Hitler once used to use. So 2 questions for you. And the first is, and I think really relevant, you raise an issue about the female being a war correspondent versus a male being a war correspondent. It's okay for him to have his life and limb at risk, but for a female to go out there is quite extraordinary. And the role that plays with regard to the responsibility of being, I'm going to use the word parent versus a mother or father, because I think it's really important, the differentiation of that. And the second, in your extraordinary presentation, which was overwhelming, is you hadn't discussed, which I have read about you, and I'm in awe, frankly, of having been kidnapped and being incarcerated.
That
and
was
threats.
Libya.
But in a broader sense, in terms of how you felt on a moment-by-moment basis, what the threats were. So those are the two issues.
Okay, so the first question, I'm unclear what the question is. Is it, do I feel being a mother is different from being a father?
No, being a champion in terms of allowing the female voice to be out there, to be able to be in a war zone versus a male being in a war zone, and it's okay for a female to be there.
I think
Is it
it's okay
okay?
for anyone to be there who's well versed in how to operate and who doesn't take stupid risks and who I think it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman so long as you have a purpose for being there and you know how to navigate that situation. I think when you're on the front line, for example, it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. I think if you are a woman, you can do certain stories in the Muslim world that men can't do. And conversely, if you're a man, you can do stories that women can't easily do. But I think it's important to have men and women. And I think in so many situations it actually doesn't matter so long as you can keep up physically and emotionally.
I agree with that, but the question really was probing a little bit further in terms of the impact within your family of a child now not going to, if something significantly dramatic happened and you couldn't come back, how that affects the child versus a mother being eliminated versus a dad being eliminated.
I don't know, I'm not a therapist, but I can say, obviously, are you asking me if I take less risks now that I'm a mother? I mean, I'm pretty straight, so you're asking
That's exactly the question. The only reason I asked that is
you could just ask it directly.
No, I will ask it directly only because it's from I'm a bit older than
Sure,
you, and I
that's
remember
fine. You can ask
when
it
I
direct.
was
I'm Italian,
pregnant
it's
with my daughter. Now, I'm not even talking about what I did as a journalist, but more about, do I ski as aggressively as I used to and break a leg?
Now we know the question. Thank you. I am still covering war. I am not going to the front line. I'm not running into combat the way I used to do. I still go to Afghanistan. I do a lot of women's stories there, for example. I go to Iraq. I try to stay away from ISIS positions. But I think there's risk in so much of this work. I'm trying to navigate it in a safer way than I know how, but I'm not stopping being a photographer. I still do what I do, but I try and do it more safely. So, yeah.
You said that the reason you were a photographer was because it provides proof, which the pictures obviously do. I just want to say they're fantastic pictures and really beautiful pictures. They're not just providing proof. Other people could do that, but they really stand out. And I wondered in relation to that two things. One was, did you talk about it? I don't think you did. Where you got trained, how you learnt to be a photographer. And the other one is a tiny question, which is there was one picture where there was a man standing on two sticks, and maybe everyone else understood the picture. I didn't understand what was happening, and if you could just tell me.
I will answer that first. It's easier. That was in Libya, and that was on the first day we started to move forward on the front line, and that was a rebel who stood up on a fence to see whether Gaddafi's troops were in sight in the distance. And so often when I'm shooting in a conflict zone, I'm not looking for traditional war images. I'm looking for something different because I think we're so inundated by those kinds of violent, aggressive images that it's actually, for me, more engaging to make something a little different. And what was the first question? Oh, no. I was not trained in photography. I never studied photography. I sort of learned on the fly and had great mentors at the AP in New York. which to me, I think working for a wire service when you're young is almost the best training you can have, because it's relentless and you have to work really hard and cover extremely boring situations to make a good picture out of it. And so for me, that was great training. But in terms of covering war, I could never afford those training courses that the sort of, I guess, they're hostile environment training courses, because they were about at least a few $1,000s, and I never had more than like $30 in the bank until I had been covering war for several years and had already been kidnapped by the time I finally started making money. So I never took one of those classes, but I luckily had great mentors and colleagues in the field who taught me so much. And I think that's really important, especially now for young journalists who want to cover war, to stick with people who have experience, because they can teach you more than anyone.
Hi.
Who's that? Oh.
I'm right here.
Hi.
So thank you so much. Very, very inspiring. You obviously seem to be incredibly courageous. My question is the instance where the father doesn't give permission. So those pictures are still with you and never getting out anywhere. And the second one is about the censorship that you said, whilst you were giving the talk, you said the censorship aspect still exists a lot. So can you sort of elaborate a bit on that, on if you sort of then go to different publications and still get the pictures out? How does that?
So in a case where I have given my word that if the next of kin doesn't allow, I will never publish those pictures. So I just keep my word. And I think that's very important as a journalist to do. And I am still in touch with the father. It's been 5 years, 6 years almost, and we still email back and forth. And he checks in every so often, and I think that we will have this bond forever, because I was with his son when he died. And so I recently was asked to do a very long interview in New York just about that situation for Radio Lab in New York. And I asked the father if he would also be interviewed, because I thought it was so important that his voice also appeared in that, and he agreed. So that, I think, will be really powerful. I mean, this just happened a few days ago. So in terms of censorship, I think it comes on many levels. I think the hardest, for me, the most difficult thing is not being able to photograph dead soldiers. You know, there are no rules against photographing dead Afghans or Iraqis or Sudanese, but we are not allowed to photograph our own dead. And I have a real issue with that. So I think it's, I think obviously it's a way for the government to, you know, protect or to stop Americans from having, from being so anti-war, you know, obviously. I mean, if you don't see dead, then how, you know, it's not happening. So, okay, this gentleman.
Yeah, hello. Thanks for this amazing presentation. I would have one question about, like, more or less like a follow-up, because you said before about the situation being in the war and like not having money on the account. And a lot of, I think, war photographers or journalists sending their stories out on a, like you said before, on a place you don't know if you're like alive the next day. Do journalists talk about in this situation that a lot of them, they don't make a lot of money, and it's more about that they want to tell the truth? I mean, I think that the question is more like if a lot of journalists who are there, they're obviously freelance, so that they can make a living with it.
I don't know, because the wars have changed so much since when I started. I think it's really tough for freelancers to cover wars like in Syria and stuff, because you need, well, first of all, I think it's almost impossible for anyone to cover Syria right now, but I think that the amount of money you need now to operate in so many of these war zones, between drivers and translators or any sort of protection, it makes it very difficult to do it safely. I don't know if people talk about it so openly. Usually now I will only cover conflict pretty much for the New York Times, because I worked with them as a freelancer for 14 years, and I know when something happens, they will have my back, and that means more to me than anything. So I think freelancers who cover war have to be they they have to be very aware of who they're working for, and will that publication step up if something does happen? And if they won't, do they want to take the chance of risking their life? I mean, those are questions that everyone should be asking themselves.
Hi.
This
Over
woman's
here.
been waiting for a long time.
So we've got this lady here, a lady here, and this lady back. Maybe this lady at the front afterwards, if we've got time, yeah?
You sort of touched on this in an answer just now, but I was wondering what kind of advice people gave you before you left New York. You went to India and then you went to Afghanistan. Was it kind of, did you get people who were negative about it as well as, and then if somebody was starting out today, would you give them the same advice, or has the game changed?
So actually, no one really said, when I decided to move to India from New York, people just, I think they thought I would just come right back. And when I didn't, I really wanted to make it as a freelancer. And thanks in large part to these two people sitting right here, they really helped me get residency in India and have like an access to a network that helped me get started in a way that I never could have done. And then in terms of going to Afghanistan, so many correspondents around me were covering what life was like under the Taliban, so it actually didn't seem that ominous. It seemed like something that I could do. Luckily, my family of hairdressers never read the newspaper. So when I called my family and said I'm going to Afghanistan tomorrow, they were like, have fun, you know. They had no idea what it was like. So I think it was not until like I was pretty far down that they realized, you know. Yeah.
You were involved with the Nobel Prize exhibit this year that honored Malala Yousafzai and the other winner.
Kailash
And I
Satyarthi.
was wondering, yes, how did you select what photographs you were going to use? And will that exhibition be leaving Oslo? Will it tour the world?
So every year the Nobel Peace Center selects one photographer to photograph the laureates, and they create a huge exhibition that the laureates then open, the Peace Prize laureates then open the day after the ceremony. And so this year it was Malala and Kailash Satyarthi, and Malala did not want to be photographed, so that was very easy. I wasn't allowed to photograph her. What we offered in exchange were the photos that I had taken of the Taliban in Pakistan. And so I had also photographed secret girls' schools in Swat Valley, where she was from. So we put those as part of the exhibition. They used file photos of her. And then she had agreed to let her school uniform be photographed and that she was wearing the day she was shot, and it was covered in blood. And so that was quite sensitive because they had never unveiled that before. And so I photographed that as well. And in terms of Kailash, he rescues children from child trafficking and child labor. And so for me, I was thrilled to be able to photograph that. I went around with his NGO in India and went on raids into factories and photographed rescues of children and then the rehabilitation. So it was a joint process of editing with the Nobel Committee. I don't know, actually. It's a good question. I have no idea, actually.
Lynsey,
Yes.
have you thought of what your answer would be if your son was to come to you and say, Mum, I don't want you to go out anymore to these places?
Oh, I thought you were going to say if he came to me and wanted to be a war photographer. I was like, he's not allowed to go to the playground.
That is a tough question.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I don't know, and I can only answer that when I get to that point. I can't, because I never try and speculate how I will feel when. I think that I'm in different phases of my life all the time, and so, yeah. It's a very good question, but I actually have no idea, to be honest. This gentleman.
Hi, Lynsey. I just want to ask you about post-traumatic stress disorder. I have a lot of colleagues who, like you, have found themselves in difficult situations, and I've seen them suffer from it. I myself have found myself in difficult situations and battle to deal with it. What sort of advice would you give journalists who, you know, in terms of how to cope with these situations to ensure that you remain kind of, you know, healthy and yeah.
I'm not sure I'm an authority at all. I know that I've been through a lot. my own personal way of dealing with it is to talk about it, and to talk about it as much as I can with people that I trust, and to not try and internalize it. And so for me, that's one of the ways. It's almost like therapy for me, but I come from a really sort of big Italian American family that talks about everything ad nauseum, you know? So I mean, there's no lack of communication in my family. So for me, that's a very important method of dealing with anything. And I also think it's important to pull back every so often. I think one of the for myself for some time, and also many of my colleagues, is to just keep going back, because war is where we feel comfortable and where we feel like, you know, we all have such a purpose there, especially if that's what you've dedicated your life to. But it is also important to make sure that you have some sort of balance, and that you have a life to return to. And so that is what I have found to be the most useful, but I certainly am no authority.
I've just got a quick question from Rue Kumar, who's watching online, and she asks what your advice would be for a 22-year-old starting out in journalism. Tricky one.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, right. Just starting out, I would say try and link up with someone, and not just try and throw yourself into it alone. Maybe try and find some mentors and really do your homework. And I wouldn't start out with Syria, for example. I would try and start out with, like, you know, in places where journalists are not as much of a target as they are in parts of the Middle East, you know. There are wars where journalists are still respected as sort of neutral and there for a purpose of documenting, and I would say those are probably better places to be, at least to start. But I don't really know. I think it's important to make sure that's what you want to do, and to realize that if that is what you want to do, there's a very good chance you probably won't have a life for about 20 straight years. So she should just make sure, you know, that's what she wants.
Hi. I'm just interested, what do you think is the most sort of challenging photo you've taken, in terms of whether it's location-wise, or in terms of building up social relationships, or getting access to take a picture? And equally, another small question is, do you feel like one of the pictures you've taken is, which one do you feel like, if you can choose, is the most powerful that you have ever taken? It's a hard question.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I get that question often, and I never really have a good answer for that, because I think I'm really attached to different bodies of work for different reasons, and that have come at different points in my life. So I think many of the pictures from the Korangal Valley sit with me, and they resonate with me still when I look at them. And often I was there to take them. I sort of look at them and think, my God, I can't believe I lived through that. So to me, some of those images are quite poignant. What was the first question? I always start backwards, sorry. The most challenging. That's a good question. I think access really varies from story to story, and something like the Taliban, obviously the hardest part about that access was what Dexter did, setting it up and like planting himself there, making the right contacts for fixers and drivers. And I think, one thing to be said is that any of the work we do as journalists is usually we cannot do without the local drivers and translators and the people on the ground, and we get the credit for it, but it's them who do all the work, So I think most of the access I've gotten on any story I've ever done has been because of whoever I'm working with, And so I think it's I can't really speak to one story, but like the Taliban, it took a long time to set up, but then once we got permission, we were in, Other stories, like I did a series on transgender prostitutes in New York in 1999 in the meatpacking district, and I went for almost a month without my cameras and just went almost every night and hung out with them until they finally said, okay, you can start shooting. So I think, it really depends on how much you want to invest, but whatever you invest in your time really pays back.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
Is there a situation or conflict or country that you haven't yet covered that you have your eye on?
Not right, no. I mean, I started working in South Sudan quite a bit, and I always want to go back there. I feel like there's a lot to cover, but I haven't been back this year. I was there last year, so I will probably go back this year. But no, I think I generally do manage to get to where I want to be. Yeah.
Okay.
Kind of. Great.
I guess that's about it. Lynsey, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was fantastic. Thank you.